Adrian Vale straightened his jacket lapel for the third time in as many minutes, and every person standing within 10 feet of him noticed. Not because the gesture was unusual, it wasn't, but because of what accompanied it, that particular angle of his jaw, the slow sweep of his eyes across the ballroom, as if cataloging everything he owned, which, in his mind, included the room itself. He had reserved 4 tables near the stage. He had approved the centerpieces. He had personally called the event coordinator to ensure the lighting fell correctly on the woman standing beside him. Serena Laurent, 29 years old, former Miss Atlantic Coast, a face that had sold perfume and sports cars and luxury watches to people who would never meet her. She was, by every external measure, spectacular, and Adrian knew it. He wanted everyone else to know it too. That was the point of tonight. Before this story goes any further, if you felt that tension just reading those first lines, wait until you see what happens next. Subscribe to this channel right now so you don't miss a single chapter of this story. Hit the like button if you're already on Elena's side. And drop a comment telling me the city and country where you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now, let's go back to that ballroom. The Aldridge Grand Ballroom on Fifth Avenue had hosted presidential fundraisers, film premieres, and at least 2 wedding receptions that later became tabloid disasters. It was the kind of place where the chandeliers alone cost more than most people's annual salary, and where the guest list mattered more than the food, which was saying something because the food was extraordinary. The annual Hargrove Foundation Gala drew the top tier of New York's financial, tech, and philanthropic worlds, the people who wrote checks with too many zeros to say out loud, who shook hands that moved markets, who smiled for photographers with the practiced ease of people who had been photographed since birth. Adrian Vale had attended for 6 consecutive years. The first 2, he had come as a rising name. The last 4, he had come as someone to reckon with. Vault Tech, his San Francisco-based data infrastructure company, had grown from a well-funded startup into a publicly traded firm worth just over $3 billion. He was 41 years old, self-made in the way that men who come from moderate comfort but not real money like to claim, and he moved through rooms like he had already decided he was the most interesting person in them. Tonight he had Serena on his arm, a 3-carat cushion-cut diamond on her finger that he had presented to her 6 weeks ago at a dinner in Monaco, a dinner he had allowed a lifestyle journalist to photograph from a discreet distance and a carefully arranged announcement planned for later in the evening. He was going to introduce her formally to his investors. He was going to let the room absorb what he had built, the company, the fortune, the future. The whole picture. He had not thought about Elena Marlowe in months. That was what he told himself anyway. The truth was slightly more complicated. Elena existed in the way old wounds exist. Not constantly present, but findable if you pressed in the right place. 2 years since the divorce. 18 months since the last lawyer letter. He had paid her a settlement, a number he considered generous, given what he privately believed about the trajectory of the marriage. She had signed the papers without a counteroffer, which he had interpreted as confirmation that he had been the engine of everything they built together, and she had simply understood that reality when finally confronted with it. She had disappeared afterward, left the country. Someone told him, gone to live in Europe or Southeast Asia, some quiet place where she would lick her wounds and eventually rebuild something modest and adequate. He had moved forward. That was what survivors did. "You're doing it again," Serena said beside him. She had leaned close enough that her words stayed private, but her eyes were tracking the room with the same studied alertness she brought to every public event. She had a talent for scanning a space without appearing to scan it, a skill she had developed during years of pageants and press events where being caught looking calculating was worse than actually being calculating. Doing what? The thing where you look like you're calculating the net worth of every person in the room. I'm not calculating anything. You absolutely are. She reached over and adjusted the fold of his pocket square, a touch that managed to be both intimate and corrective. "You've got that face." "I'm fine, I know you're fine." "I'm telling you the face is visible." He softened slightly, or made an effort to. "You look incredible tonight." "I know," she said, and she smiled, and she meant it without vanity, which was one of the things he had originally found refreshing about her. She was self-aware in a way that looked like confidence rather than arrogance. "Come on, Franklin Marsh is by the bar, and you said you needed 5 minutes with him before dinner." They moved through the crowd, and Adrian settled into the rhythm of the evening handshakes, introductions, the particular social aerobics of a room where everyone was networking while pretending they were simply socializing. He had a glass of champagne. He made the rounds. Serena was charming and warm and said the right things, and he watched people respond to her and felt the satisfaction of a plan unfolding correctly. Then, at 8:05 p.m., the ballroom's main doors opened. He didn't notice immediately. Doors opened. People arrived late. That was part of the evening's texture. He was mid-sentence with Franklin Marsh. Something about Vault-Tec's new server architecture when he registered a subtle shift in the room's noise level. Not silence, not yet, but a kind of pressure drop, the social equivalent of a held breath. The kind of pause that happens when something unexpected enters a space that considers itself prepared for everything. He turned. She was standing at the top of the entrance steps in a black velvet gown that moved like water when she walked, and for a fractured second his mind did something strange. It recognized the posture before it recognized the face. That way she carried her shoulders, level and unhurried, like someone who had decided a long time ago that rushing was for people who weren't sure of their destination. He knew that posture. He had watched it cross rooms for 9 years. Elena. She had cut her hair since he last saw her shorter now, framing her face differently, making her cheekbones more prominent. She looked rested in a way she had not looked during the final years of their marriage, when the weight of everything they were going through had lived in her eyes, even when she smiled. The gown was simple in the way that expensive things manage to look simple, no ornamentation, no drama in the fabric itself, just the architecture of it, the way it draped. And then his eyes moved, because his brain was finally processing the whole image rather than the familiar face at its center. She was visibly pregnant, not enormously so, 5 months, perhaps 6, but unmistakable, the soft, deliberate curve of it visible through the fitted bodice of the dress, and she wasn't hiding it. She had dressed around it, dressed toward it, the gown cut to acknowledge the fact of her body rather than minimize or conceal. His champagne glass tilted in his hand. He caught it, barely. And then the man beside her came into focus. Nathaniel Cross stood 6 feet tall with the unassuming physical presence of someone who had nothing left to prove and had understood that for long enough that it showed in how he stood. He was 53 years old, gray at the temples, wearing a dark suit with no tie, and he was one of the 3 or 4 most recognizable faces in the investment world. Not because he sought recognition, but because his firm, Cross Capital, had backed enough transformative companies in the last 2 decades that financial journalists had made a minor industry out of profiling him. His personal net worth was, depending on which estimate you used, somewhere between $8 and $12 billion. He did not attend galas as a rule. He was famously, almost aggressively private. He was standing beside Elena with one hand resting at the small of her back, in the practiced, proprietary ease of someone who had been doing it long enough that it was no longer a gesture. It was simply where his hand went. The room had gone quiet, not the performative silence of a planned announcement. The organic, startled quiet of a crowd collectively recalibrating. People who had been in separate conversations drifted toward better sightlines. Heads turned. Phones appeared with the subtle shame of people who know they shouldn't but can't help it. Elena moved down the entrance steps without looking at Adrian. She spoke to someone near the door, accepted a glass of sparkling water from a passing server, with a small nod of thanks, and then her eyes swept the room in a way that was neither searching nor avoiding, just a person arriving at a place and orienting herself. And then her eyes found his. He had not moved from where he stood. She looked at him for a moment, 3 seconds, 4, with an expression he could not read. Not triumph, not coldness, something quieter and more difficult to name. And she looked away and turned to say something to Nathaniel, and that was it. He was dismissed, not dramatically, not with any detectable intention. Simply moved past, the way you move past something that is no longer part of your route. Adrian, Serena's voice close and sharp, your glass. He looked down. His champagne had sloshed, a pale, wet crescent on his shirt cuff. He hadn't felt it happen. Who is that? Serena asked. She was watching Elena with the specific attention of a woman who had learned to identify threat through texture rather than obvious signal. Nobody, he said. The word came out wrong too fast, too flat, and he heard it as soon as he said it. Serena looked at him. That's her, isn't it? It wasn't a question. She had seen the photographs. She had heard the outline of the story, the first wife, the difficult marriage, the divorce. He had kept the details spare, not out of dishonesty exactly, but because he genuinely believed that what had happened between him and Elena was over and irrelevant, And he didn't enjoy the sensation of being asked to excavate it. It doesn't matter, he said. She's with Nathaniel Cross. I can see that, Adrian. Serena put a hand on his arm. She's pregnant. I know. And she's with Nathaniel Cross. Serena, I'm not spiraling, she said, and her voice was controlled, which was its own kind of warning. I'm just observing. Across the room, someone had approached Elena and Nathaniel, a silver-haired man Adrian recognized as Douglas Emmett, a senior partner at a fund that had declined to invest in Vault-Tech's last round. Emmett was laughing at something Elena had said, leaning into the conversation with the engaged, approving posture of a man who was genuinely pleased rather than professionally polite. Adrian watched that. He picked up a fresh champagne glass from a passing tray and turned back to Franklin Marsh, who had the tact to pretend he had not witnessed any of what just happened. You were saying, Adrian said, about the Q4 projections. Right, Marsh said carefully. Right, yes. They continued the conversation. But something in Adrian's chest had shifted, a small, unpleasant pressure, like weather moving in. He had met Elena Marlowe in the fall semester of their junior year at the University of Michigan, in a macroeconomics seminar that both of them had enrolled in as an elective, and that turned out to be significantly harder than either had anticipated. He noticed her first in the way most people noticed Elena. Not immediately, not in a flash, but gradually as she kept saying things in class discussion that he found himself thinking about afterward. She had a particular way of reframing problems. She didn't start from conclusions and work backward. She started from first principles and followed the logic wherever it went, even when it led somewhere inconvenient. He had grown up around people who argued to win. Elena argued to understand. It was, for him, genuinely foreign. They started studying together. They argued about everything: economic policy, market structure, what people owed each other, what systems were worth preserving, and which ones deserved to collapse. She grew up in Tulsa, the daughter of a high school history teacher, and a woman who ran a small catering business, and she had worked her way through school on a partial scholarship and 2 part-time jobs. She was not impressed by his family's comfortable Westchester background, not dismissive of it either. She just didn't treat it as data about him. He was unusual to her because of how he thought, not where he came from. He fell in love with her, the way you fall in love when you're 20 completely, and without understanding what you're doing until you're already in it. They graduated together. He had the idea for what would eventually become Vault-Tech. At the time, just a vague, poorly articulated sense that there was a fundamental problem in how mid-size enterprises managed distributed data. Elena was the one who helped him shape it into something coherent. She had no particular interest in technology, but she understood markets and incentive structures in a way that most people with MBAs didn't, and she sat with him through hundreds of hours of whiteboard sessions, asking questions that forced him to clarify what he actually meant rather than what he wanted to sound like he meant. They married when he was 26, 2 years into the first round of funding, in a ceremony at a state park outside Tulsa, because that was where her family was, and that was what she wanted. For a while, it was good. The problem with "for a while, it was good" as a description of a marriage is that it doesn't tell you the thing you actually need to know, which is when exactly "for a while" ends. It's not a date. It's not an event. It's a collection of small decisions, small moments where one person chose themselves over the other, until the collection becomes a pattern, and the pattern becomes the marriage, and eventually someone notices. What changed with Adrian was the company. Not immediately. There was a period, maybe the first 3 or 4 years, when the pressure of building Vault-Tech kept them genuinely dependent on each other in a way that functioned as intimacy, even when they were exhausted. But as the company grew, as the rounds got larger, and the board got more formal, and his face started appearing in the kinds of profiles that made people in San Francisco treat him differently than they had before, something curdled. It happened gradually, and then it happened all at once. The meetings where her input was invited became meetings where her input was acknowledged, but not incorporated, and then meetings where it was acknowledged in the abstract. We'll take that under advisement, Elena, thank you, and then meetings she wasn't invited to at all. It wasn't malicious exactly. It was something messier and harder to confront. He had started to see her the way people see a first draft, valuable for what it produced, incomplete by the standards of the finished version. And then there was the other thing. They had tried to have a child for 3 years. The first pregnancy ended at 11 weeks, the second at 8. The third was a daughter, a girl they had already named, who came 6 weeks early and did not survive. Elena had held her for 40 minutes in the NICU, and the nurse had been kind, and Adrian had stood at the window outside the room because he could not make himself go in, and he had never fully explained to Elena why that was. He told himself it was shock. He told himself he was protecting her by holding himself together. He had believed that for years. What he had not been able to admit was simpler and worse. He had been angry. Not at Elena, not exactly, at the situation. At the way this thing he had not planned for, had not factored into his timeline, had become the central emotional catastrophe of their marriage, in a way that displaced the company, displaced his plans, displaced him. He had been angry that she needed him to be devastated in a way that he did not know how to be, and his anger had expressed itself as distance. And the distance had expressed itself as the particular cruelty of a person who is present but absent answering questions, moving through shared spaces, sleeping in the same bed, and communicating, through every small behavior, that he was somewhere else entirely. She had known. Of course she had known. The divorce had been his idea. He had framed it to himself, and occasionally to other people, as a mutual recognition that they had grown in different directions. A clean, rational conclusion reached by two adults. The settlement was fair, he maintained. He had given her the house in Marin and a lump sum, and the terms were clean. She hadn't fought. She had signed the papers in the conference room of her lawyer's office, while he waited in a car outside. He had not been in the room, and the lawyer had sent over the signed copies by messenger, and that had been the end of it. He had told himself she was fine, that she was practical, like him, underneath everything, that she would land on her feet. He had not asked. By the time dinner was served, the room had redistributed itself in ways that told a story. Elena and Nathaniel were seated at a center-right table with Douglas Emmett and three other people Adrian identified as senior figures from Cross Capital's portfolio world. They were deep in conversation, not performative conversation, the kind that happens at galas when people are seen talking, but actual conversation, with paper napkins that someone had pulled out and written on, and the specific body language of people who are actually arguing about something and enjoying it. Adrian watched from his table. Serena was talking to the man on her left, a tech journalist from a publication that had done a flattering profile on Vault Tech 2 years ago, and she had engaged him fully, which was something she was very good at. She could be at a dinner and also somewhere else entirely, maintaining the social surface while running a separate internal calculation. He had admired that quality in her. Right now he was grateful for it, because it meant she wasn't watching him watch Elena. He turned his attention back to his own table. Vaultech's been quiet on the acquisition front, said the woman across from him, Patricia Aldine, a venture partner at a fund he had wanted to pitch. Last I heard you were looking at the Marek Systems deal. We're still evaluating, he said. The fundamentals are there. The timing needs work. She looked at him with the neutral expression of someone who knows more than they're saying and has decided that saying it is not worth the investment. And the Series D runway? Still 18 months? Comfortably. Good, because I heard the Q3 numbers were softer than projected. He kept his expression steady. Market conditions affected the whole sector. Sure, she lifted her wine glass. Sure they did. He got through dinner. He smiled. He made the rounds. He shook hands with people whose handshakes meant money and said the things that were expected of him, and did not look across the room at the table where Elena was laughing at something Nathaniel had said, a real laugh, the kind she used to do in their kitchen in the early years, with her whole face. He did not look. He looked. It was after the main course, during the loosening period when people stood and circulated, and the evening became less structured, that Serena found her way to Elena's table. Adrian saw it happen from across the room and did not move quickly enough to intercept it, or possibly he moved slowly enough on purpose. He wasn't entirely honest with himself about which it was. Serena approached with the particular composure of a woman who has decided to make something happen and has dressed it as a social call. She was gracious. She was warm. She said, "Elena, I'm Serena. I don't think we've formally met." She extended her hand. Her ring was visible. He had chosen it to be visible. Elena looked at the hand, then at Serena. Then she took the hand and shook it with the matter-of-fact ease of someone who has no particular feeling about what's happening. "Serena," Elena said, "I've seen you in the press. Congratulations on the engagement." Serena smiled. "Thank you. And we're both very happy." She let the "we're" sit there, waited. "I didn't know you'd be here tonight." I don't think Adrian mentioned it. He wouldn't have known, Elena said. "I'm here with Nathaniel." She said it without emphasis, which was its own kind of emphasis. Of course. Serena's eyes moved briefly to Elena's midsection and back up. You look wonderful. Really. Pregnancy suits you. Thank you. A beat, the kind of beat that could go several ways. I hope you're not finding it difficult, Serena said. Being back in the city. After everything. Elena tilted her head slightly. It's fine. I like New York. It's just that Adrian mentioned the divorce was quite hard on you. Emotionally, the table had gone quiet around them. Nathaniel had stilled beside Elena. Not tense stilled, like someone who has placed their attention very precisely on a specific point. Elena looked at Serena for a moment. Did he, she said. He's mentioned it. Not in detail. Just that it was a difficult period for you. I'm sure he described it that way, Elena said. Her voice was even and light, which was somehow worse than if it had been sharp. People do tend to describe their own behavior in ways that are easiest to live with. Serena's smile held but changed quality. I don't think he meant. Serena. Elena set down her water glass. You came over here to see who I am and whether I'm a problem. I don't blame you for that. It's sensible. You're wearing his ring in a room where his ex-wife just walked in with someone who has more capital than he'll ever see. That's a strange situation. She paused. I'm not a problem. I'm here because Nathaniel has business here, and I wanted to come. That's all. You can tell Adrian whatever you like. Serena opened her mouth, closed it. Enjoy your evening, Elena said. Serena walked back across the room toward Adrian, and her expression was controlled enough that only someone paying close attention would have noticed that the evening had just shifted in a direction she had not planned for. Adrian was paying close attention. He watched her come back to him, and he asked quietly, What did you say to her? Opened with congratulations, Serena said. She stopped. She's different than I thought she'd be. Different how? Serena looked at him. Then she looked away. We should go say goodnight to the Hargroves, she said. It's getting late. He stood there for a moment after she moved away, his champagne glass in his hand, looking across the ballroom to where Elena had already turned back to her table and re-engaged with the conversation, as if the last 5 minutes had been nothing more than a brief interruption in a more interesting evening. And standing there, in the middle of a room full of people he had cultivated and impressed and carefully positioned himself among, Adrian Vale felt something he had not expected to feel tonight. He felt like he had missed something important. Not this room, not this gala. Something older than that, and further back, and gone now in a way that probably couldn't be recovered. He couldn't name it precisely. He wasn't the kind of man who was good at naming that kind of thing. He straightened his jacket. He went to find Serena. The ballroom continued around him, loud and bright and indifferent. And somewhere in the middle of it, Elena Marlowe reached over and put her hand over Nathaniel's. And he turned his palm up, without looking away from the conversation he was in, and his fingers closed around hers. The car ride back to Adrian's penthouse on Central Park West was 23 minutes, and neither of them said anything meaningful for the first 15. Serena sat with her heels off, her feet tucked under her on the leather seat, her phone face down in her lap. She was looking out the window at the city moving, past the blur of streetlights and late pedestrians, and the particular New York darkness that was never quite dark, and she had the expression of someone sorting through something they hadn't finished sorting. Adrian sat on his side of the car with his jacket unbuttoned and his eyes forward, and the silence between them was not comfortable, but it wasn't hostile either. It was the silence of two people who are both thinking about the same thing and have not yet agreed on how to talk about it. The driver turned north on 8th Avenue. She's not what I expected, Serena said finally. Adrian didn't look over. You said that already. I'm saying it again because I'm still figuring out what I meant by it. She picked up her phone, looked at the screen, put it back down. I expected someone I don't know. Softer. Someone who'd be uncomfortable tonight. Who'd maybe leave early. Elena doesn't leave early. Clearly. A pause. How long were you married? 9 years. 9 years, she repeated. Not with any particular accusation. Just absorbing the number. And in 9 years, you never told me she was... She stopped and chose the word carefully. Like that. Like what? Like that, Adrian. Like someone who walks into a room and the room notices. She finally looked at him. You described her as someone who struggled, who was fragile, who couldn't handle the pressures of your life together. That's not exactly what I said. It's what you communicated. He didn't answer. She's not fragile, Serena said. She's the opposite of fragile. And she's pregnant, and she's with one of the most powerful investors in the country, and she looked at me like I was... She paused again. like I was something she was being patient about. You're reading into it. I'm reading it correctly. She turned back to the window. Who is she, actually? Not the version you gave me. Who is she? The car crossed 57th Street, and Adrian finally shifted in his seat, leaning his elbow against the door, his hand across his mouth in the way he did when he was thinking something through that he didn't especially want to think through. She's smart, he said. It came out with a flatness that was almost involuntary, like a fact he had stated so many times internally that saying it out loud had become mechanical. Her mind works differently than most people's. She takes things apart, everything. Arguments, structures, assumptions. She's not comfortable with conclusions that haven't been earned. Serena was quiet. We met in college, he said. Economics seminar. She was the only person in the room who'd do the actual reading and then argue with the textbook in class. He almost smiled. Almost. The professor loved her. Everyone found her exhausting. Did you? No. He said it simply. I don't know. I found it interesting that she cared that much. What happened to her after? He turned to look out his own window. She left. Went to Europe. I heard through someone she was in Portugal for a while. Then I stopped hearing. And you didn't ask? No. Because you thought she was fine? Because I assumed she would be. Serena absorbed that. The car pulled up to the building, and the doorman came to open the door, and she got out without waiting for Adrian. And by the time he followed her inside, she was already at the elevator, shoes in her hand, her back straight and her face composed and giving nothing away. They rode up in silence. She went to bed before him. He sat in the dark in the living room for a long time, not drinking, just sitting, with the lights of the park below him and the ceiling above him and the particular discomfort of a man who has just discovered that a story he told himself for 2 years was missing several significant chapters. The question that kept returning, stubborn and unwelcome, was not about Nathaniel Cross. It was not about the money, or the pregnancy, or any of the obvious things that a man in his position might be expected to fixate on. The question was simpler and harder. When exactly had she stopped needing him to notice her? And had he noticed when it happened? The answers to both, he suspected, were the same, and neither was flattering. He sat with that until past 2 in the morning, and then he went to bed, and he lay next to Serena in the dark and stared at the ceiling, and did not sleep for a very long time. What Adrian Vale did not know, had not known, had not thought to ask about, had not been told, was that the 2 years since the divorce had been, for Elena Marlowe, the most formative of her adult life. Not the easiest, not the least painful, the most formative. The distinction mattered. She had cried on the plane leaving San Francisco. She would say that to people later when she talked about that period. Not often and not in public, but to people she trusted. She had cried in the window seat of a transatlantic flight to Lisbon because the alternative was sitting in an apartment that still had his coffee maker and his sports trophies and the particular shape of his absence pressed into everything. And she had looked at that life and understood clearly and without ceremony that she could not reconstruct herself inside it. She needed empty space. She needed somewhere he had never been. Lisbon was someone else's city, which was the point. She had rented a small apartment in Alfama, the old neighborhood that climbed the hills above the river, where the streets were too narrow for most cars, and the tiles on the buildings were blue and white and cracked from age. And she had lived there for 4 months doing almost nothing. Walking, reading, sitting in cafes for 3 hours with a single coffee and a notebook, writing things she'd never show anyone. She had taken long walks along the water and watched fishermen work, and felt, for the first time in years, the strange relief of anonymity, of being no one's wife, no one's strategist, no one's particular disappointment. She had been 37 years old, newly divorced, with no professional title and a bank account that was adequate, but not what anyone who knew her would have predicted for someone of her abilities. The settlement Adrian had provided was fair in the technical sense. The Marin house, the lump sum, but the house she had sold because she couldn't imagine living in it alone. And the lump sum was capital, not income, and she had looked at it the way she had always looked at capital, as something to deploy rather than something to spend. She had started small. The first investment she made from Lisbon was a company she had been watching for almost 2 years before the divorce, a logistics software firm based in Rotterdam that was doing something genuinely interesting with route optimization for mid-size freight companies. She had brought it up to Adrian's team twice during their marriage. They had passed, both times, on the grounds that the market was too narrow and the founders were unproven. Elena had watched the company from a distance, tracked their numbers through every public report available, and concluded that the team was excellent and the market was wrong. She put in $200,000 of her own money. 11 months later, the company was acquired by a Dutch multinational for a number that returned her initial stake at 17 times its value. She was not surprised. She had done the analysis. But she sat in her Alfama apartment the afternoon the wire cleared and looked at the number in her account and felt something shift. Not excitement, exactly. More like the quiet, clarifying sensation of a person who has just been reminded what they're actually good at, after a long period of being defined by what they weren't. She had made 2 more investments from Lisbon before she moved on. Both were in women-led companies. Both were in sectors that traditional venture capital treated with performative interest and structural neglect. One in sustainable food production, one in maternal health technology. She chose them because the fundamentals were strong, and also because she understood, in a way that was now personal rather than theoretical, how much talent existed in spaces that the major funds didn't look at carefully enough. She moved to Singapore 8 months in, then to London. Then, in her second year, she spent 4 months based in New York, not Manhattan, but Brooklyn, in a sublet in Carroll Gardens that cost a fraction of what anything in her old life had cost, and she liked it. She liked the subway. She liked the farmer's market on Court Street on Saturdays. She liked being in a city that contained her history without being defined by it. She met Nathaniel Cross at a private economics conference in Zurich. She had not expected to meet anyone. She was not in a phase of expecting things from other people. She was in a phase of building her own architecture and discovering, piece by piece, that it was sturdier than she'd thought. She had attended the conference because a woman she'd connected with through the Rotterdam investment had invited her, and because the panel on alternative market structures included 2 researchers she had been following. Nathaniel was not on any panel. He was in the audience, 2 rows ahead of her, taking notes by hand in a small black notebook, which was unusual enough in a room full of people typing on laptops that she noticed it. He asked a question during the Q&A that reframed the entire preceding discussion, and she watched the panel collectively recalibrate in real time, which was something she found genuinely satisfying to witness. They ended up at the same smaller dinner afterward, 12 people, a restaurant near the conference hotel, someone's introduction of her to him over bread and olive oil. "Elena Marlowe," he said, and shook her hand. "Are you the Marlowe who looked at the Rotterdam acquisition before it happened?" She had been surprised. "How do you know about that?" "I was watching that company," he said. "I almost moved on it. I got there 2 weeks after your deal closed." He said it without self-pity, just as information. "Your timing was better. My analysis was better," she said. He had looked at her for a moment, and then he had laughed. A real laugh, the kind that involved his whole face. "Fair enough," he said. "What did I miss?" She had told him. They had talked through the Rotterdam deal for 45 minutes while the dinner moved around them, and the other 10 people at the table gradually gave up trying to pull them into other conversations. He listened in the way that very few people listen, not waiting for his turn to speak, not collecting points for a counter-argument, but actually following the thread of what she was saying and then picking it up from where she left it. It was not, that first evening, romantic. It was something more foundational than romantic. It was the experience of being taken seriously by someone who didn't need anything from her, who had no agenda she was useful to, who was genuinely interested in how she thought because he found it interesting. It had been so long since she'd had that experience that she almost didn't recognize it. They exchanged information. She thought it would be professional occasional emails, the kind of loose network connection that happens at conferences and slowly goes cold. But he called 2 weeks later to ask her about a deal he was evaluating in the Nordic market. She told him what she thought, with specifics, and 2 weeks after that he called again, and it became a pattern. Not romantic yet, something more durable than that, a working respect that deepens slowly and without drama, the way things deepen when neither person is performing. The romantic part came later, and it came slowly, and it was not uncomplicated. She had been wary in ways she hadn't had to be before. She had made him earn her trust in the specific currency of trust. Not charm, not declarations, just consistency. He was patient about it in a way that seemed genuine rather than strategic, which she tested, over and over until she was satisfied. She told him about the pregnancies. It was a late evening in his apartment in London, 6 months into whatever they were by then, and she had been talking about something else, and then she had said it, not dramatically, but not easily either. The facts, 3 pregnancies, 3 losses, the last one the hardest, the grief that had sat inside her marriage, like an uninvited tenant for years until it had eventually eaten through the walls. He had listened without interrupting, which she was grateful for. When she finished, he said, "I'm sorry. That's a lot to have carried." "I didn't carry it well," she said. "I was angry for a long time. At the situation, at him, at myself for expecting him to show up for it." "Did he?" She considered. He was present in the way that some men are present technically there, functionally somewhere else. He was dealing with his own version of it. I don't think he ever let himself actually grieve it. He just absorbed it into the ambient stress of everything else and kept going. "And you?" "I stopped," she said. "That's the difference. I had to stop." And he didn't know what to do with someone who had stopped. Nathaniel had been quiet for a moment. "Can I ask you something?" "Yes. Did you want to have children still after?" She had thought about it. "I didn't know," she said honestly. "For a long time I thought that chapter was just closed. I was okay with it being closed." She paused, and then I wasn't. And then I was in a different situation than I'd planned for, and the question reopened, and she stopped. "And," he said, "and I decided I wanted to find out," she said, "whether my body would cooperate, whether I could do it without doing it inside a situation that was already broken." He had looked at her for a long time. "Okay," he said. That was what he said. Just okay. And she had known, hearing it, that he meant it as a full sentence, not a prelude to conditions, not the opening of a negotiation. Just okay. She was 39 when she got pregnant. The first trimester was terrifying in a way she had not been able to prepare for. She had waited, week by week, for the thing she feared, had measured herself against past experience, braced for the worst with a discipline that looked from the outside like calm. But the 12-week scan had been fine, and the 16-week scan. And at 20 weeks, the technician had turned the monitor toward her and shown her a profile, a spine, the flutter of a heartbeat that was working independently of her anxiety about it. She had cried in the car afterward alone before calling Nathaniel. Not from sadness, from the simple, enormous relief of something being allowed to continue. She had not planned to attend the Hargrove Gala. It was Nathaniel's decision. He was on the Hargrove Foundation's advisory board, a commitment he took seriously enough to honor in person despite his general aversion to the social circuit that surrounded it. He had asked her if she wanted to come. "Adrian will probably be there," she said. "I know. Does that factor in at all for you?" He had looked at her across the kitchen table. "Does it factor in for you?" She had thought about that honestly. "I don't want to avoid rooms because he might be in them," she said. "I've spent 2 years building a life that isn't arranged around what he does or doesn't do. It would be strange to start now." "Then we go," he said. "Yes," she said, "we go." She had not expected the ballroom to go quiet when she entered. That had been a surprise, not an unwelcome one, but a surprise. She had chosen the gown because she liked it, because it fit, because she was 23 weeks pregnant. The phase of trying to minimize herself was something she had exited years ago in a small Lisbon apartment, making investments that no one in her former life knew about, learning who she was when no one was asking her to be someone else. She had seen Adrian from the top of the steps. The champagne, the slight stumble, she had watched that. She would have had to be blind to miss it, and she had made the choice, in the space of 2 or 3 seconds, to look at him plainly and then look away. Not as a power move, or not only as one, because she had something more important to do with the evening than manage his reaction to her existence. She had people to meet, ideas to talk about. A man beside her whose hand, when she reached for it later in the evening, would close around hers without hesitation. And she had, somewhere in the quiet below the noise of the ballroom, a son who was already learning the particular rhythm of her heartbeat calm, now, or mostly calm, and she was not going to disrupt that rhythm for Adrian Vale's benefit. She was not going to disrupt it for anyone's. The decision Elena had made, somewhere between Lisbon and London and Singapore and finally this ballroom, was not a dramatic decision. It did not come with a speech or a gesture or a moment she could point to and say, "There, that's where things changed." It was quieter than that. It was the decision, made incrementally and then permanently, to stop building herself around the shape of his expectations. She had believed in him once. She had worked herself into the architecture of his ambition and called it partnership, and for a while that was almost true. There had been years when the line between what was his and what was hers was genuinely blurry, when they were actually building something together, and those years had been real, and she did not discount them. But somewhere in the middle of the company's ascent, The architecture had shifted, and she had found herself occupying a room that no longer had her name on the door. And when she had knocked from the inside tentatively at first, then more directly, the answer had been the silence of someone who has stopped checking whether the room is occupied. She had knocked for a long time before she stopped. The stopping was not surrender. That was the thing she had needed to learn. She had been afraid that leaving meant she had failed. At the marriage, at the life they had built, at the very particular and exhausting project of being loved by someone who found it easier to be admired. But leaving had turned out to be something else. It had turned out to be the first decision in years that was entirely hers. She thought about that sometimes, in the way you think about things that are finished, not with grief, but with the particular clarity that distance provides. She had never needed his permission to be who she was. She had given herself that particular limitation, slowly and without noticing, and then one day she had looked at it and understood what it was, and she had set it down. That was the story. Not a dramatic one from the inside. Not the version that made for clean narrative, no single villain, no single moment of revelation, no clean before and after. Just a woman who had believed something about herself that turned out to be wrong, and who had taken 2 years and a lot of quiet mornings in foreign cities to find her way to something more accurate. She was still finding it. She would be finding it for a while. Parenthood had not arrived with certainty attached, and she was under no illusion that having a child with Nathaniel Cross would solve anything that was unsolved in her. She had the usual fears, the ordinary terrors, layered on top of the specific ones that came with her history. But she was not hiding from any of it. That was the difference. When Serena had approached her table and she had seen it coming from across the room, had watched Serena make the decision and move toward her with the precise, contained grace of a woman who had been trained to perform composure under pressure, Elena had felt something close to compassion, not condescension, something more honest than that. Serena was wearing a ring that had been chosen partly for its visibility, was engaged to a man whose understanding of the women in his life was, to put it gently, incomplete, and had walked across a ballroom to make a social assessment of the woman who'd come before her. Elena understood that impulse. She had been inside it herself in different rooms at different ages. She had been patient with Serena. She had been direct. And then she had ended it cleanly because the evening was not about that conversation. Nathaniel had said nothing, during or after. He had sat beside her and let it play out and trusted her to handle it, which she had, and when it was done he had simply resumed the conversation they'd been having about the Emmett Fund's new mandate, and she had been grateful for that, for the absence of commentary, the absence of the need to process it publicly, the simple confidence of a person who knew she didn't need managing. Later, after the dinner, after the gala had softened into the final hour of circulating and handshaking and gradual exits, she had found herself standing near the tall windows that overlooked Fifth Avenue, looking down at the street below Taxis and Couples and the ordinary 10p. Movements of the city, and she had put one hand on the curve of her belly, lightly, as she sometimes did without planning to. Her son moved, a small rolling pressure, unhurried. She stayed at the window for a while. She was not thinking about Adrian. She was not thinking about what he had felt when he'd seen her, or what Serena had gone back and reported to him, or what version of tonight he was going to carry forward into his private understanding of his own life. She was thinking about a fund she was in the middle of structuring, a women's investment fund she had been building the architecture for over the past 8 months, a vehicle designed to direct serious capital towards serious female founders who were being systematically underestimated by the traditional VC world. She had the outline. She had 3 anchor investors already committed. She had been in conversation with 2 others whose participation would change the scale of what was possible. She had been trying to decide on a name. Standing at that window, with her hand on her son and the city below her doing what it always did, she thought she might call it something plain, something that didn't reach, a name that said exactly what it was, without dressing it up. She hadn't landed on it yet, but it was coming. She could feel it the way she could feel a good investment, not a certainty, but as the kind of quiet confidence that doesn't need to announce itself. She turned from the window. Nathaniel was waiting, not impatiently, just present, his jacket over one arm, talking to Douglas Emmett about something that had them both animated and laughing. He caught her eye from across the room. She walked toward him. Behind her, somewhere across the Aldridge Grand Ballroom, Adrian Vale was straightening his jacket one last time, getting ready to leave, carrying with him an evening that had not gone the way he'd planned, though he would not have said so, to Serena or to anyone, because he was not yet ready to understand why it hadn't. That understanding would come. But not tonight. Tonight, Elena Marlowe crossed the room toward the person who was waiting for her, and the evening held itself together around that fact, and nothing about it needed to be more than what it was. The morning after the Hargrove Gala arrived the way mornings do after events that refuse to stay where you put them gray and too early, with the particular silence of a city that hasn't decided yet what kind of day it wants to be. Adrian was awake before 6. He didn't sleep badly, exactly. He slept the way he'd been sleeping for the past several months, adequately, efficiently, in the manner of a man whose body had learned to perform rest, even when his mind hadn't quite committed to it. He lay in bed for a few minutes after the light changed from dark to gray, listening to Serena's breathings beside him. And then he got up and went to the kitchen and made coffee and stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows looking out at Central Park, which was still half dark and had joggers on the paths already, because this was New York, and this was how New Yorkers punished themselves. He checked his phone. There were 3 emails from members of his board that had come in overnight. Not unusual, his board members operated across time zones and had a collective indifference to the concept of off hours. But the subject lines gave him a specific low-grade sensation that he recognized as the precursor to a longer conversation he was not going to enjoy. The first email was from Marcus Delaney, his lead board member, and one of Vault-Tech's earliest institutional backers. The subject line was simply "Re-Q3 need to talk." The email itself was 4 lines, which with Delaney was either nothing or everything. It said the Q3 numbers needed more context than the official commentary had provided, that 2 of the other board members had questions, and that Marcus would like a call today if Adrian had time. He always had time for Marcus. Not having time for Marcus was not a category that existed. The second email was from Patricia Aldine, the venture partner he'd sat across from at dinner the night before, the one who had said market conditions affected the whole sector with the tone of someone observing a slow-moving accident. She wanted a call as well. The phrasing was polite. The timing was not. He put the phone face down on the counter and drank his coffee. The thing about Q3 was that Q3 was not a crisis, not technically. The numbers were soft in 2 divisions, which was real but explainable. A contract renewal that had pushed into Q4, a product launch that had been delayed by 6 weeks for engineering reasons that were legitimate and had been communicated to the board in August. The revenue picture was not alarming. The cash position was stable. If you looked at the fundamentals with any patience, the story was manageable. The problem was that no one was looking with patience right now. Vault-Tech had spent 3 years in the position of a company that could do no wrong, the kind of market darling status that was wonderful while it lasted and deeply dangerous in its side effects, because it trained investors to expect consistency that no company of its complexity could actually deliver. The first quarter with numbers that didn't meet elevated expectations was not a data point. It was a narrative shift. And narrative shifts in Adrian's world moved faster than facts. He had known this was coming. He had not known it would arrive the same morning as the rest of it. He heard Serena moving in the bedroom, the sound of the bathroom door, the shower, the specific domestic signals of another person getting up and becoming themselves. He refilled his coffee. He picked up his phone again and put it back down without opening any of the emails. At 6:53, Serena came into the kitchen in a silk robe, her hair wet, and poured herself a glass of water. She stood at the counter and drank it and looked at him. "You were up early," she said. "Couldn't sleep. Board stuff?" "Some. She refilled the glass. Last night, I know." "Do you want to talk about it?" "Not particularly." He paused. "Not yet." She studied him for a moment with the particular expression she used when she was deciding how far to push something, a calculation that she usually resolved correctly, which was one of the things he genuinely valued about her. She set the glass down. "I have the Whitmore luncheon," she said, "and the fitting at 3. I'll be back by 6. "Fine." She moved toward the bedroom, stopped. "Adrian." She didn't turn around. "You should call Marcus back first. The board stuff doesn't get easier if you wait." She went back to the bedroom. He called Marcus at 7:15. The call lasted 42 minutes and covered the Q3 numbers, the Marex Systems acquisition timeline, the performance of Vault-Tech's enterprise division, and toward the end, in a register that Marcus used when he wanted something on the record without making it a formal agenda item, the question of whether Adrian had a communications plan for the current market perception issue. That was what Marcus called it, a market perception issue. He did not call it what it was, which was a slow-building crisis of confidence that had been accumulating for 2 quarters and had not been addressed with anything except optimism. "We need more than optimism at this point," Marcus said. "The story has to be tighter. Investors need to understand what the next 18 months look like. I've been saying the next 18 months look fine. Adrian. Saying it and demonstrating it are different things." A pause. "There are questions being asked about the Marek deal. Whether the timeline is realistic, whether the enterprise numbers are being managed forward. These aren't my questions. They're coming from your investors." "Which investors?" "Several." The deliberate vagueness of a man who knew the list was longer than he was going to say. "I want a clean strategy document on my desk by end of next week. Not talking points. An actual plan with actual numbers." "You'll have it. Good." A brief pause. "How was the gala?" "Fine," Adrian said. "I heard Elena was there." He had known this was coming. The financial world was simultaneously enormous and the size of a small town. "She Cross." Marcus was quiet for a moment. "Cross doesn't usually do the gala circuit." "No." "Wonder what brought him out." There was nothing pointed in Marcus's voice, which was its own kind of pointed. "Anyway, the strategy document. End of next week." "You'll have it," Adrian said again. He ended the call and sat with the phone in his hand, and the coffee going cold on the counter, and the park below him filling with morning light. And he thought about what Marcus had not said, which was that Nathaniel Cross's appearance at the Hargrove Gala, with Elena on his arm and Cross Capital's weight behind her, was the kind of detail that investors noticed. That the woman who had helped build the early vision of Vaultec, whom Adrian had described, in various ways over the years, as having not been well suited to the demands of his professional world, was apparently well suited enough to be the companion of one of the most respected capital allocators on the planet. He thought about what that said to his investors. He thought about what it said, period, and then he decided to stop thinking about it and went to get dressed. The press item dropped at 11:47 that morning. He was in the office, in a glass-walled conference room, running through the Q3 numbers with his CFO and 2 members of the communications team when his phone started. Not a call texts from 4 different people in succession, all variants of, "Did you see the piece in Capital Week?" He excused himself. The article was not long. Capital Week was a financial media outlet that ran shorter, faster pieces than the major publications, more newsletter than magazine, with a reader base that was precisely the slice of the market he most needed to manage right now. The piece was titled "Cross Capital's Quiet Pivot. New Fund Architecture Points to a Different Kind of Bet," and it was, on its surface, a story about Nathaniel Cross's investment philosophy. But the third paragraph named Elena Marlowe as the strategist and economist widely credited with originating the conceptual framework behind the new fund structure, and the 6th paragraph described her own independent investment portfolio, which, the article noted, had been built quietly over 2 years and had generated returns that, in at least 3 identified sectors, had significantly outperformed conventional VC benchmarks for the same period. The article did not mention Adrian or Vaultec by name. It did not need to. He read it twice, standing in the hallway outside the conference room, while through the glass his CFO and the communications team waited with the patience of people who were pretending not to notice. The number that stuck with him was not the return figures, though those were substantial. It was the timeline. 2 years. She had been building this for 2 years quietly, from overseas from apartments in cities he'd never visited with her, making investments that no one in his world had known about. While he had been picturing her, vaguely, as someone who had retreated to recover, she had been constructing something that was now attracting serious coverage in a publication his entire board read before 9A. He went back into the conference room. "We'll pick this up after lunch," he said. "I need an hour." His CFO looked at him. The numbers. After lunch. He called his chief of staff, Daniel Park, from the car on the way to nowhere in particular. He just needed to be moving. "The Capital Week piece," Daniel said before Adrian could say anything. "You saw it. 15 minutes ago. I've already had 2 calls." "From who?" "Patterson at Meridian in a pause, and Delaney's office." That was fast, even by Marcus's standards. What did Delaney's office want? To confirm the call from this morning was sufficient, or whether Marcus should expect a follow-up, which meant Marcus wanted to know whether Adrian was rattled. Tell them the morning call was sufficient. Okay. Daniel's voice had the careful neutrality of someone who had opinions he was choosing not to offer. There's also a request from the Capital Week journalist for a comment on the Vault-Tec side of the industry picture. Not specifically tied to the piece, but tell them no comment. That's what I assumed. There's one more thing. What? The fund Elena Marlowe is apparently structuring the women's investment vehicle. I've been looking at the public documentation that's been filed. The anchor investor list is not public, but the fund architecture is registered, and the initial capital commitment disclosed is... He stopped. It's significant, Adrian. It's not a small-scale project. The car moved through midtown traffic. Adrian looked out the window at nothing. How significant? Initial disclosed capital is $240 million. That's anchor money, before any additional closes. He said nothing for a moment. Okay, he said. Keep monitoring. He hung up. $240 million in disclosed capital for a first close was not, in absolute terms, the largest fund launch he'd ever seen. But for a first-time fund manager, which was technically what Elena was, despite her track record, it was extraordinary. It meant the anchor investors had enough confidence in her judgment and her deal flow to write substantial checks before she had a formal track record as a fund manager. It meant Nathaniel Cross's backing was not merely personal. It was structural. She wasn't just his partner. She was his bet. He sat with that for the rest of the drive. The second wave of the story broke in the afternoon, and it came from a direction he hadn't anticipated. A financial podcast, one of the better ones, with a listenership that overlapped significantly with Institutional Money Ran, a same-day episode that had clearly been prepared in advance of the Capital Week piece, but released in coordination with it. The episode was an interview with a female founder whose company had received early backing from Elena's independent portfolio. The founder described Elena as the first investor who actually read our model instead of our pitch deck, and the person who asked the right questions before anyone else knew what questions to ask. The episode was 40 minutes long. Adrian listened to 12 minutes of it and stopped. By 4 p.m, the piece had been shared extensively within the financial community, and 2 larger publications had filed follow-up pieces. One a profile request that Elena's representative apparently declined, and one a more analytical piece about the structural gap in venture capital's treatment of female founders and the emerging wave of funds attempting to address it. Elena was mentioned in 3 paragraphs of the second piece, with a quote attributed to a source who described her framework as one of the more rigorous analytical approaches to this space currently operating. He was not in any of it. This was not how invisibility usually felt. Serena came home at 6:15, earlier than she'd said, and he knew from the way she came through the doorcoat still on, bag not yet set down, that she had seen some version of the day's coverage. She sat down on the couch with her coat on. "How bad is it?" she said. "It's not bad. It's complicated, Adrian. I'm managing it." The Capital Week piece has been shared 4,700 times as of an hour ago. I checked. She finally took her coat off. 3 people at the Whitmore luncheon asked me about it, with varying degrees of subtlety. He sat down across from her. "What did you say?" "I said we were proud of what Vault-Tec is building, and I wasn't the right person to speak to market dynamics." She paused. Margaret Whitmore told me she'd heard Elena's fund was already oversubscribed at second close, and that several of the investors in the room had been approached. He was quiet. One of them, Serena said, is someone who passed on Vault-Tec's last round. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. That's circumstantial. Maybe. She looked at him. But it doesn't look good. "I know how it looks, do you?" She wasn't angry. She was something more precise than angry. She was assessing, in the manner of a person who has been adding up a column of numbers for 24 hours and has now arrived at the total. "Because what I'm seeing is that you've spent 2 years telling a particular story about your marriage and your ex-wife and why things ended the way they did. And in the last 24 hours, the actual story has become visible. To your investors, to your board, to the people whose opinions of you are tied directly to their confidence in your judgment." He didn't respond. "I'm not attacking you," she said. "I'm telling you what I'm observing, because someone should, and I'd rather it be me." The room was quiet for a moment. "She built something real," he said. It came out without particular emotion, flat, like a fact being admitted under conditions that made it unavoidable. "Yes," Serena said, "she did. I didn't think she would." "I know." He stopped. I wasn't trying to be cruel about it. I genuinely believed that she couldn't. He didn't confirm it. But he didn't deny it. Serena looked at him for a long moment. "What did she actually do for Vault-Tec?" In the early days, before it became what it is. He was quiet. "Tell me honestly," she said. "Not the version you've told. The honest version." He stood up and went to the window. The park was fading into its evening colors, the last flat light of late afternoon on the reservoir, the trees beginning to go dark. He stood with his back to her for a while. "The first pitch deck," he said finally. "The one that got us the seed round. The entire market framing section was hers. The argument about where enterprise data infrastructure was going. The gap she identified between what the market needed and what it was being offered. That was her analysis." He stopped. "The second round, when we were pitching the institutional investors, the TAM breakdown, the competitive moat argument. She built that. I presented it. I understood it well enough to defend it. But I didn't originate it. Does anyone know that? The people in those rooms. They might not have. They saw me present it. They didn't know the backstory. So you got the credit. I was the founder. That's how it works. That's how it worked for you," Serena said quietly. He turned around. She was looking at him with an expression he couldn't fully read, not contempt, and not pity exactly. Something more difficult. Something that looked like she was in the process of revising something she had believed about him, and was not yet sure what to put in its place. "I liked the version of you I had before last night," she said. "I want to be honest about that. It was a cleaner version, more comfortable." "Serena, I'm not ending anything," she said quickly. "I'm not saying that. I'm saying I'm recalibrating. I need to recalibrate, and I need you to let me do that without managing me." He sat back down. They stayed in the room together in a silence that was not comfortable, but was at least honest, which was, he was beginning to understand, not nothing. The call came the following morning. Not from Marcus, not from the board. It came from James Whitfield, a senior partner at Khloe Ventures, who had been one of the more bullish institutional voices behind Vault-Tech's growth trajectory for the last 4 years. Whitfield was not an alarmist. He was also not the kind of man who called without a purpose. "I'll be direct," Whitfield said, which was how he began every conversation that mattered. "There are questions circulating about Vault-Tech's pipeline. Not catastrophic questions, but the combination of the Q3 softness and the visibility, let's call it, of certain other investment activity adjacent to your orbits, creating some noise I think you should be aware of. I'm aware of it." "Good. Then you're also aware that 2 of the companies in Elena Marlowe's independent portfolio are direct sector competitors to Vault-Tech's enterprise division." He had not been aware of that specifically. "Which 2?" he said. Whitfield told him. He knew both companies. He had looked at one of them 18 months ago and passed, on the grounds that the team was strong, but the go-to-market was unclear. He had not looked at it since. He had no idea what the go-to-market looked like now. "How are they performing?" he said. "The first one just closed a Series B at a valuation that's—" Whitfield paused with the precision of a man who knows that numbers land harder when they're given space. "That's difficult to reconcile with the Vault-Tech enterprise segment's current growth rate." He closed his eyes briefly. "I understand," he said. "I'm not pulling support," Whitfield said. "I want to be clear about that. I'm calling you because I believe in the underlying business, and I want to have confidence that the people running it have a clear picture of the competitive landscape, including the parts of it that are personally adjacent." "The analysis stands on its own," Adrian said. "My personal situation doesn't affect Vault-Tech's fundamentals." "Of course." A brief pause. "I know that. I just want to make sure you're not distracted." The word sat in the air. "I'm not distracted," Adrian said. "Good," Whitfield said. "Then let's plan to talk next week. Bring the Q4 projections and the Marek update. I want to hear the story in your own words." He hung up. He sat at his desk in the Vault-Tech offices, the San Francisco headquarters, which he was running from the New York satellite this week, and looked at the surface of the desk, which was clean and organized the way his desk always was, and he thought about 2 companies that he had missed, or not followed, or both, and that were now backed by money that ran through the hands of a woman who had once sat across from him in a macroeconomics seminar and argued with the textbook in a way that he had found, at 20 years old, genuinely interesting. He had stopped finding it interesting at some point. He was trying to remember when. There was something he hadn't told Serena and hadn't told anyone because it belonged to the category of things he carried alone, which was a large category and one he had maintained with considerable discipline over the years. 3 weeks after the divorce was finalized, he had called Elena's cell phone. He didn't know what he intended to say. That was the truth of it. He had picked up the phone at 11 p.m. in the Marin house that was technically still shared property and hadn't yet transferred, sitting in the kitchen with all the lights off, and dialed her number. It had rung 4 times and gone to voicemail. Her voice, unchanged, professional. "You've reached Elena Marlowe. Please leave a message." He had sat there with the phone against his ear for the full duration of the outgoing message. And then he had hung up without saying anything. He had told himself afterward that it had been the right call, not to leave a message, not to complicate the clean legal lines of a finalized separation. He had told himself she was better off with the clarity. He had told himself a lot of things that had the structure of rational argument and the texture of something he was trying very hard not to examine. What he had not told himself, because he had not been capable of it at the time, was the simpler thing underneath. He had called because he missed her. Not the wife he'd had at the end, when the marriage had become a contest of silences. Not the woman he'd been patient with or failed to be patient with through 3 pregnancies that had broken something between them that never fully healed. He had missed the person he'd met in that seminar room, who argued with the textbook and then walked across campus with him in the October cold and ate terrible dining hall food and talked about market structures until midnight because she genuinely wanted to understand how things worked. He had missed that person, and he had hung up without saying so, and he had gone to bed, and the next day he had gone to the office and done the work that needed doing and continued forward, which was what he did, which was what he was good at, which was not, as it turned out, the same thing as being good at being a person who let other people matter to him in ways that required him to do something costly in return. He was sitting with that now, in a way he hadn't before. The financial complications were real. The board pressure was real. The Whitfield call was a signal he needed to take seriously. All of that was true, and all of it needed managing. But underneath it, quieter and more persistent and considerably less manageable, was the recognition that he had looked across a ballroom 36 hours ago at a woman he had walked away from had, in the specific grammar of what he'd actually done, pushed toward the door while believing he was simply unlocking it, and what he had seen was not what he'd expected to see. He'd expected to see someone who had survived him. He'd seen instead someone who had, without drama or announcement, built a life that had nothing to do with surviving him, that didn't need his permission or his acknowledgement or his particular version of what a woman who used to be his wife was supposed to look like 2 years after the papers were signed. He had expected to be, at minimum, a chapter in the story she was telling. He was not sure he was even a footnote. That was the thing about the way she had looked at him at the top of those stairs. 3 seconds. 4. That quiet expression he couldn't name, and then looked away. It wasn't hatred, and it wasn't forgiveness, and it wasn't performance. It was something simpler. It was the look of a person who had finished something and moved on to whatever came next, and the thing they had finished no longer required energy to maintain. She had finished him, not in any dramatic sense, just set him down, moved past, the way you move past something that is no longer part of your route. He had told himself for 2 years that he was the one who had moved on. He was only now beginning to understand what that word actually meant when applied to someone who had used it correctly. His desk phone rang. It was Daniel, with the revised Q4 projections and the Marek update. He straightened in his chair, picked up the receiver, and put on the voice he used when things needed managing. "Send it through," he said. "I'll be ready in 10 minutes. He put the phone down. He looked at the desk for one more moment. The clean surface, the organized stacks, the careful architecture of a life arranged to project certainty, and then he opened his laptop and got back to work, because that was the thing he knew how to do, and for now it was enough, and he was not yet ready for the alternative. The strategy document Adrian sent to Marcus Delaney on Friday was 31 pages long and represented the most carefully constructed piece of corporate narrative he had produced in 4 years. He had worked on it with Daniel and the CFO, and 2 members of the communications team, and he had reviewed it 3 times himself before sending, and it was good, genuinely good, the kind of document that addressed the real concerns without conceding more than necessary, and laid out a credible path forward that his board could hold on to. Marcus acknowledged receipt with a 2-line email that said the document was thorough and that he'd have comments by Monday. Adrian read the email twice, trying to determine whether thorough was a compliment. He decided it wasn't a compliment, but it wasn't the opposite of one either, which was the best he was going to get from Marcus on a Friday afternoon. So he put the phone down and went to find Serena, who was in the living room with her laptop and a glass of wine, doing the work she did when she was processing something, which was to be very busy with something else. They had reached a functional equilibrium over the past 3 days that was neither resolution nor standoff. They were still sharing the penthouse, still eating meals together, still moving through the architecture of their shared life with the ordinary motions of a couple. But there was a conversation that hadn't happened yet, a real one, not the version they'd had the night she came home early, which had been honest but incomplete, and they were both aware of it in the way you're aware of a room in a house you haven't gone into yet. It would need to happen. The timing was unclear. "How's the document?" she asked without looking up. "Sent," Marcus acknowledged, and he called it thorough. She made a small sound that communicated efficiently everything she thought about that. She turned a page. "There's an event next Thursday," she said. "The Meridian Capital Dinner. Patterson specifically asked if you'd be there." "I'll be there." He also asked if I'd be there. Something in her tone made him look up. She was still looking at her laptop, but her jaw had the particular set of someone who had made a decision and was waiting for the right moment to say it. "What's happening Thursday?" he said. She closed the laptop, set it on the cushion beside her, picked up her wine glass, and held it with both hands the way she did when she was settling in for something. "I think we need to be honest with each other," she said, "about what we're doing. Serena, I'm not ending the engagement." She said it quickly, as if she'd anticipated the derailment. "I need you to hear that first. I'm not sitting here to blow up our life. But I need to say something, and I need you to actually listen." He sat down across from her. "I have been," she said carefully, "performing a version of being fine that I'm getting tired of. Since the gala. And I think you know that, and I think you've been letting me perform it because it's easier than the conversation." He didn't deny it. "I'm not in competition with Elena Marlowe," she said. "I want to be clear about that. I'm not threatened by her in the way that a person in a romantic context gets threatened. That's not what this is." She looked at the wine glass. "What I am is—" She stopped. "I feel like I agreed to be the next chapter in a story without being told all of what was in the chapters before. And now I'm finding out, alongside everyone else, and that's not—" She stopped again. "That's not what you signed up for," he said. "That's not how I want to operate in a relationship." She looked at him directly. "I need to know things. I need you to tell me things. Not the managed version. Not the version that makes you look most navigable. The real version." He was quiet for a moment. "What do you want to know?" he said. How much of Vault-Tech's early success was hers? He had known she was going to come back to this. He had been, since Tuesday, half preparing for it, in the way you half prepare for something you're not sure you're ready to say. A significant portion of the conceptual architecture, he said. The market framing that made the first round possible. The competitive analysis that held up through the institutional rounds. Her thinking was foundational to the story I was able to tell. And when the company got big enough that there was credit to assign, it went to me, because I was the founder and the public face, and that's how it works in that world. Did you ever tell her that you knew how much she contributed? He sat with the question for a moment that was slightly too long. No, he said. Serena nodded. Not with satisfaction, with the expression of someone who has had a suspicion confirmed and takes no pleasure in being right. Okay, she said. Okay, I'm not sure what okay means. It means I'm processing. She uncurled her legs from beneath her, set the wine glass down. It means I'm trying to figure out whether the version of you I'm with now is the version that did those things, or a version that understands them, or both, or neither. She looked at him. I'm not sure you know the answer to that either. And I think that's something we need to actually figure out, together, before the Meridian dinner. Before we stand in rooms together performing the life we're supposed to have. I understand, he said. Do you? Yes. He said it without the automatic certainty he usually brought to that word. I'm not sure I've been good at knowing what I understand until after the fact. That's something I'm aware of. She looked at him for a while. Then she picked up her wine glass again. That's the most honest thing you've said to me since Monday, she said. I know. It's a start, she said. The Global Capital Innovation Summit took place in Chicago, at the Meridian Conference Center on Michigan Avenue, across 2 days in early November. It was one of the 3 or 4 annual events that the investment and tech world treated as genuinely unmissable, not because of the panels, which were often recycled conversations between the same voices, but because of what happened around the panels, the hallway conversations, the private dinners, the bilateral meetings that were scheduled weeks in advance and conducted in conference rooms without windows, where the real decisions about who was backing what and why happened away from the public agenda. Adrian had attended every year for 5 years. He was on a panel this year, a conversation about enterprise technology's next infrastructure cycle, which was useful positioning given Vault-Tech's current narrative challenges. He had prepared for it carefully. He had not been prepared for Elena to be a keynote speaker. He found out the way he found out most things now, where Elena was concerned belatedly, and through a source that implied the information had been available for some time. Daniel had mentioned it 3 days before the summit, in the same tone he used when he was delivering something he'd been uncertain about when to raise. The summit organizers had extended the keynote invitation 6 weeks ago. She had accepted. The topic of her address was listed in the official program as Capital with Intention, Rethinking Who Gets Backed and Why. You didn't tell me earlier because Adrian had started. Because I wasn't sure it was directly relevant, Daniel said. And then it became more directly relevant. He had looked at the program. Her session was the second morning, 11 a.m., in the main hall. His panel was the afternoon of the same day, at 3. They were in the same building for 6 hours. He had gone anyway. There was no serious alternative canceling the panel appearance 6 days out. With the current market perception questions surrounding Vault-Tech, was not a viable option. He went. The summit's first day was occupied with the necessary industry, socializing dinners and sidebar conversations, and the quiet business of being seen engaging with the right people. He navigated it competently. His panel conversation the following day was about enterprise infrastructure, and he had the material cold, and he was good in rooms like this, articulate and calibrated, able to read the temperature of a conversation and adjust without losing his central message. It was one of the skills that had genuinely carried him. He did not see Elena on the first day. He saw evidence of her name in conversations, her fund mentioned twice in the context of other discussions about alternative investment structures, once by a woman he didn't know who worked at a pension fund and was speaking to her colleague about an upcoming LP meeting. The Marlowe framework, she called it, which was a phrase he had not heard before and which lodged in his mind with the specific stubbornness of things you try not to think about. He had dinner with Whitfield that evening. Whitfield was measured and positive in the way he was when he was watching something carefully. They talked through the Vault-Tech pipeline, the Marek timeline, the Q4 setup. It was a productive dinner. At the end of it, Whitfield said, "You should go to the keynote tomorrow morning. Elena Marlowe, I've seen the abstract. It's sharp." Adrian looked at him. "I'll be there," he said, because there was no other answer. He arrived at the main hall at 10:55, which was late enough that most seats were filled, and he took a place near the back, which was not where he usually sat at these events, but which felt, that morning, like the appropriate position. The hall seated roughly 600 people. Most of them were there. Elena walked onto the stage at 11 o'clock exactly. She was 7 months pregnant now, visibly, significantly so, and she had not made any architectural adjustments to manage it. She wore a dark charcoal blazer and dark trousers and moved to the podium with the unhurried gait he recognized from the ballroom 3 weeks ago, the walk of someone who had decided where they were going. She did not begin with pleasantries. "The most expensive thing in venture capital," she said, "is pattern recognition that is calcified into bias. And the cost isn't paid by the people doing the recognizing. It's paid by the people they don't see." The room was quiet in the attentive way that rooms get when someone starts a speech and the first sentence is better than expected. She talked for 40 minutes. It was not a polemic. That was what surprised him. He had anticipated something with heat, something shaped by grievance, because he was beginning to understand, consistently underestimated the breadth of her, mistaken her precision for narrowness and her restraint for limitation. Instead, she delivered an analysis, a rigorous, clearly structured examination of how capital allocation in technology ventures had systematically underweighted founders who didn't match the prevailing pattern. Not through malice, she said, but through something more persistent and harder to address, the deeply human preference for the familiar. She used data. Her own fund's early deals, 3 of which she walked through in specific detail, the market thesis, the founder profile, the decision points where conventional capital had passed. She talked about how the Rotterdam logistics investment she had made from a Lisbon apartment had outperformed the sector benchmark by a factor of 4, not because she had taken unusual risk, but because she had done analysis that went one layer deeper than the standard framework. She talked about what it cost to be the person in the room who wasn't being seen. There is a specific kind of exhaustion, she said, that comes from having your analysis absorbed into someone else's presentation. from watching your framework become their strategy, from knowing, with the particular clarity of someone who built the thing, that the story being told in your name isn't yours. She paused. A beat. I'm not talking about theft. I'm talking about the ordinary, structural, mostly unconscious way that institutions take what is useful from the people they have not decided to fully believe in and give the credit to the people they have. The room was very still. She was not looking at him. He was in the back. She could not have picked him out of 600 people in a lit hall. But he felt the words land with the physical specificity of something aimed. This is not a story about victimhood, she continued, and her voice was even and controlled and did not invite that reading. It's a story about what happens when you stop waiting for the institution to correct its own error. When you stop asking for a seat at a table that was built for someone else's dimensions, and you go build a different table. She paused. The women founders I have backed in the last 2 years were not lacking in ability. They were lacking in access to people who were willing to look at them long enough to understand what they had. That's the gap my fund exists to close. Not as charity, as arbitrage. Because the market is wrong about them, and markets that are wrong about things are for the people who notice in time opportunity. Applause. Not polite applause. The kind that begins before the sentence is fully finished, which is the only kind worth having. She talked for 8 more minutes. The fund's current portfolio, the second close they'd recently completed, the sectors they were focusing on in the next 18 months. She ended without a flourish. She said, capital deployed with intention performs better than capital deployed by habit. The evidence for that is accumulating. I'd invite you to look at it. She walked off the stage to a standing ovation that reached the back of the hall. He did not stand immediately. He sat for a moment in the noise of the room around him, with his hands on his knees, and the particular sensation of someone who has just watched 600 people understand something he should have understood years ago. Then he stood, because sitting would have been conspicuous, and the room was still loud around him, and he needed a moment to exist as someone who was simply applauding, rather than someone for whom this was specific. He found Nathaniel Cross in the hallway, outside the main hall 20 minutes later. He had not planned to. He had been heading toward the conference center's smaller meeting rooms, where he had a scheduled sidebar with a potential partner, and Nathaniel had been standing near the window at the far end of the hall with a coffee, looking at his phone. He looked up when Adrian approached, and for a moment neither of them moved. Then Adrian closed the remaining distance. Nathaniel, he said. Adrian. Nathaniel put his phone in his pocket. He was not unfriendly. He was also not performing warmth. He was just there, in the manner of a person who had decided in advance to handle whatever this was with straightforwardness. That was a strong keynote, Adrian said. Yes, Nathaniel said simply. It was. A beat of silence that was not quite comfortable. I want to say something, Adrian said. He had not planned this either, not the specific words, which meant they came out less managed than his speech usually was. And I want to be honest about the fact that I'm not sure I have the right to say it at all, given the context. Nathaniel waited. I made a lot of assumptions about what Elena was capable of, Adrian said. After the divorce. During the marriage, actually. I told a story about the end of that relationship that put a particular frame on who she was and how she functioned and what she needed. And that story was, he stopped. Wrong. It was wrong in a way that I'm only now understanding the dimensions of. Nathaniel looked at him steadily. Okay, I'm not asking for anything, Adrian said. I'm not here to negotiate I don't have a play here. He stopped again. It was uncomfortable, the stopping, and he was not a man who was comfortable with discomfort in his own speech. He was used to knowing what he was going to say before he said it. I wanted to say to someone who actually knows who she is, that I understand I was wrong about her. About how she worked, what she was building, what she was capable of. Nathaniel was quiet for a moment. Can I ask you something, he said. Yes. During the marriage, the early years of Vault Tech. Did you know, when you were in it, how much of the strategic architecture was hers? The question sat in the air between them. Adrian had been asked some version of this by Serena. He had answered it then with the benefit of her patience and a living room and a glass of wine. Answering it here, in a conference center hallway, to the man who was building a life with the woman in question, that was different. Yes, he said. Not always in the moment. But yes, I knew. And you let the credit land where it landed. Yes. Nathaniel nodded. Not in condemnation, just in the manner of a person absorbing a confirmation of something they had already understood. I didn't take Elena from you, Nathaniel said. I want to be clear about that, not because I need to defend anything to you, but because I think you know it and I want it said plainly. She was already finished with that part of her life before she and I met. What I found was someone who had already done the work of understanding what had happened to her. The work wasn't mine to do. She'd already done it. I know, Adrian said. Do you? I'm starting to. Nathaniel looked at him for a moment, with the kind of regard that comes from someone who has no particular stake in your redemption and is therefore more credible than someone who does. She doesn't hate you, he said. I want you to know that, because I think some part of you has been carrying the weight of what you might find if you look directly at it. She's moved through it. That doesn't mean what happened was fine. It means she chose not to be organized around it anymore. Adrian looked at the floor for a moment. He stopped. Is she okay, actually? She's better than okay, Nathaniel said. Not warmly factually. She's tired. Because she's 7 months pregnant, and she gave a keynote this morning, and she has 3 LP meetings this afternoon. And she is stubborn about not canceling things, which is something I've stopped arguing about. But he paused, and something in his face changed slightly, in the small private way that happens when someone thinks about a person they love without meaning to let it show. She's good. She knows who she is. That took her a while to get to, but she got there. Good, Adrian said. He meant it. A beat. Your panel's this afternoon, Nathaniel said. It wasn't a threat or a dismissal, just a redirect toward the facts. 3 o'clock. I'd go over the competitive landscape section if I were you. 2 of the companies she mentioned this morning are in your space. The audience will know that. They'll be listening for whether you know it too. Adrian looked at him. Not a play, Nathaniel said. Just advice. You gave a good company to investors. You should give them a good panel. He picked up his coffee. He nodded once, with the specific brevity of a man who has said what needed saying and considers the conversation concluded. Adrian stood in the hallway for a moment after Nathaniel walked away, with the particular sensation of someone who has just been treated more fairly than they deserved, which is its own complicated kind of gift. Then he went to find the meeting room for his 3 o'clock sidebar. His panel was at 3, and he was good. And he knew it while it was happening. The preparation showed, and he had taken Nathaniel's advice and addressed the competitive landscape with a specificity that satisfied the room. He didn't name Elena or her fund. He didn't need to. He talked about the companies she'd mentioned and what they were doing and why Vault-Tech's approach was differentiated. And he did it in a way that was honest about the competitive pressure without being defensive about it. And the moderator pushed him on several points, and he held the positions he needed to hold and conceded the ones he shouldn't have defended. After the panel, Whitfield found him. Better, Whitfield said. Thank you. The competitive section. That's what people needed to hear. That you understand the actual landscape. I'm working on understanding more things more accurately, Adrian said. Whitfield looked at him. That's an interesting way to put it. It's an accurate one. They walked to the evening reception together, and Adrian spent 2 hours in conversations that felt, incrementally, like the beginning of something that might stabilize. Not quickly, not without continued effort, but possibly. The board pressure was real, and the Q3 numbers were real, and the Merrick timeline was going to require a difficult conversation with several investors before it was resolved. None of that had changed. But something in his own internal posture had shifted. He could not have said precisely when it happened, during the keynote, or in the hallway, or in the panel when he was forced to name his competitors out loud and acknowledge their strength with the equanimity of someone who wasn't afraid to look at the actual picture. Somewhere in that sequence, something had rearranged itself. Not dramatically, not in the way of conversions and revelations. Just a slow, quiet adjustment the way a building settles. He called Serena from the hotel room that night. How was the panel, she asked. It went well. And the keynote, Elena's. He had told her it was on the schedule. Strong, he said, very strong. Did you talk to her? No, he paused. I talked to Nathaniel. A silence. How was that? Honest, he said. He was honest. I was honest. It was uncomfortable, and I think it was necessary. She was quiet for a moment. Are you okay? I don't know yet. He sat on the edge of the hotel bed in the dark, the city of Chicago visible through the window, the lake, the lights, the particular flatness of the Midwest horizon. I think I've been carrying a version of that marriage that was useful to me and not accurate. And I'm in the process of putting down the useful version and figuring out what the accurate one actually costs. Serena paused. That's more self-aware than I expected tonight. Yeah, well, long day, Adrian. What, come home, she said. Tomorrow. Come home and let's have the conversation we haven't had yet. All of it. Okay, he said. I'm not making you any promises about what the conversation ends in, she said. I want to be honest about that. I know. But I want to have it. So do I, he said, and meant it in the uncomplicated way, not as strategy, not as management. Just as the simple truth of a man who was tired of the distance between what he presented and what was actually there, and who was not yet sure how to close it, but was, for possibly the first time in a very long time, genuinely willing to try. He stayed on the phone with her for another 40 minutes, talking about nothing important, a restaurant she wanted to try, something her sister had said, the small domestic currency of two people maintaining a connection across distance. It was not resolution. It was not a clean ending to anything. But it was real, and he held on to it, and the city outside the window kept doing what cities do, indifferent and continuous, and he sat in the middle of it with the particular mix of exhaustion and something that might eventually become clarity. He would fly home in the morning. He would have the conversation. He would face the board and the numbers and the competitive landscape and whatever else needed facing, in the way that he faced things through work, through preparation, through the willingness to stay in a room with a hard problem until something gave. He had just never been very good at applying that willingness to himself. That was the thing he was carrying back from Chicago, along with his luggage and his amended talking points, and the particular weight of two conversations that had each, in different ways, told him something he hadn't been ready to hear until now. He was not going to be better at it overnight. He was going to be bad at it, and then, slowly less bad at it, in the way that people improve at things they've avoided long enough that starting feels enormous, and then turns out to be just starting. That was going to have to be enough. For now, in the dark of a Chicago hotel room with the lake somewhere out there and Serena's voice still warm in his ear from the phone call that had just ended, it was. He flew back from Chicago on a Thursday morning, and the conversation with Serena happened that evening, and it was as difficult as she had promised it would be, and as necessary as he had known it would be, and it lasted 4 hours with a break in the middle when she went to get water and stood at the kitchen counter for a few minutes not saying anything, and he sat on the couch and waited and did not try to fill the silence, which was itself a small and hard-won improvement over the version of him that had existed 6 months ago. She asked him things he didn't have clean answers to. She asked him whether he had loved Elena or whether he had loved the version of Elena that was useful to him. And he sat with that question for long enough that the sitting was its own answer, and she watched him sit with it and did not rush him. And eventually he said he thought it had started as the first thing and become the second thing, gradually enough that he hadn't noticed the shift, which was possibly the most honest sentence he had spoken about his first marriage to anyone, including himself. She asked him whether he was in love with her with Serena. He said yes without the pause which she registered. But, she said. No, but, he said, I'm in love with you. That's not the complicated part. What's the complicated part? Whether I know how to be in a relationship without doing the same things I did before, without realizing I'm doing them. He looked at his hands. I'm not sure I have enough self-awareness yet to catch it in real time. I only seem to understand what I've done after there's enough distance to see it. She paused. That's a real problem, I know. It's also the kind of problem that can be worked on, she said. If the person who has it is actually willing to work on it. Not just acknowledge it. Work on it. I know the difference, he said. Do you? I'm learning the difference, he said, which was more accurate, and she heard the difference and accepted it. They did not resolve everything that night. The engagement did not end, and it did not crystallize into something more certain either. It remained in the particular suspended state of two people who have chosen to continue without yet knowing exactly what the continuation looks like, which is uncomfortable and honest, and possibly the only version of continuing that was worth anything. She went to bed before him. He sat in the dark living room again. The same chair, the same park outside the window, the same city doing its city things, and he thought about what Nathaniel had said in Chicago. She's moved through it. That doesn't mean what happened was fine. It means she chose not to be organized around it anymore. He had been organized around it. That was the thing he was only now seeing clearly enough to name. He had built the narrative of his divorce into the architecture of his self-understanding in a way that required Elena to be a certain kind of person-contained, dependent, lesser, because if she wasn't that person, Then the story he told about what had happened between them was not the story that had actually happened. And Adrian Vale was a man who was very good at building structures and very resistant to examining whether the foundation was sound. The foundation had not been sound. He was going to have to rebuild on something more accurate, and it was going to be slow, and he was going to be bad at it sometimes. And Serena was going to have to decide whether she wanted to be present for that process or not, and he could not control which choice she made, which was itself something he was going to have to learn to tolerate, because he had historically handled the things he couldn't control by reclassifying them as things he didn't need. He sat with all of that. He went to bed. He did not sleep easily, but he slept. The Marlowe Fund, which was what people had started calling it, though the official name was simply Marlowe Capital Partners, completed its second close in the third week of November, at a total committed capital figure that the financial press reported with the specific emphasis of something that was not supposed to be this significant this fast. The number was north of $400 million. For a fund that had not existed 18 months ago, managed by a woman who had never run a fund before, it was the kind of figure that required a reevaluation of the word debut. Elena did not celebrate the second close publicly. She acknowledged it in a short statement released through the fund's communications contact, which thanked the investors for their confidence and said that the capital would be deployed with the same analytical framework that had guided her independent portfolio work rigorously, patiently, and in service of founders who were building things the market was not yet paying adequate attention to. She then went to a prenatal appointment, came home, ate the specific lunch she had been eating most days for the last month, because it was one of the few things that didn't make her feel like her body had turned against her, and took a nap, which she was deeply grateful for and which lasted 2 hours because she had given up fighting the need for it. Nathaniel was in London for 3 days of meetings that week. He called every morning and every evening, not because she required it, but because it was what he did, which was the thing about him she had still not entirely accustomed herself to, the consistency. Not the grand gesture, not the romantic declaration. The daily fact of him, showing up in the ordinary ways, morning and evening, without requiring anything from her in return except that she answered. He called on the evening of the second close. "How are you feeling?" he said. "Like I've been inflated," she said. "Physically, and also financially. 412 million. Approximately." She shifted on the couch, which had become an engineering challenge. "The calls today were a lot. I had 12 calls before noon. You should have let Daniel handle some of them." "Daniel isn't the fund. I am. You're also 8 months pregnant, I'm aware." He was quiet for a moment. Not the silence of someone who had run out of things to say, but the silence of someone who was choosing not to say the thing they were thinking, which with Nathaniel was always a deliberate decision rather than an oversight. "Say it," she said. "I want you to hire someone to help with the operational load," he said. "Not a co-manager. I know you don't want that. An operations director. Someone who handles the infrastructure so you can focus on the investment decisions." "I've been thinking about that, and I'm interviewing 2 people next week," she said. "So you can stop worrying." "I wasn't worrying," he said. "I was preparing to make an argument." "I know. You were building up to it very patiently." "I've been told I'm patient." "You've been told correctly." She pulled the blanket up around her. "How's London?" "Cold. The meeting with the Harrington Group went well. They're interested in co-investing on the Oslo deal." "Good. I told you they would be. You told me they might be." In Elena language, that's the same thing. He laughed. The real laugh, the one that involved his whole face even when she couldn't see it. She could hear the shape of it. She fell asleep on the couch at 9:15 with the television on and a book face down on the cushion beside her, which was becoming the standard end to her evenings. And she had stopped being self-conscious about it the way she had briefly been self-conscious about everything in those early months of the pregnancy. The changes to her body, the pace of her life, the fact that she could no longer get through a full workday without a period of absolute inertia somewhere in the afternoon. She had been embarrassed about the inertia for about 3 weeks, and then she had stopped being embarrassed about it because the embarrassment was a luxury, and she had more important things to spend energy on. Her son, who did not yet have a name, kicked her awake at 2 in the morning, which he did regularly, and with an enthusiasm that suggested he had opinions about her sleep schedule. She put a hand on her belly in the dark. "I know," she said aloud, to the room, to the particular occupant of her body who had been communicating his preferences with increasing force for the past 6 weeks. "I'm awake." She lay there in the dark for a while, not trying to go back to sleep immediately, just present with the city sounds outside and the specific weight of the life she was carrying in every sense. She thought about the fund. She thought about the 3 portfolio companies whose Q4 numbers were due to her in the next 2 weeks, and whether the logistics company in Utrecht was going to hit its ARR target, and whether the materials science startup in Toronto had resolved the hiring problem she'd flagged to its founders in October. She thought about a woman named Carmen Ruiz, who had pitched her 3 weeks ago, a 44-year-old civil engineer from San Antonio, who had built a software platform for infrastructure maintenance scheduling that was extraordinary in its specificity and utility, and had been turned down by 11 different funds, most of which had given her feedback that amounted to, "The market is too niche," or "We prefer founders with more prior startup experience," or some variation of "We see the potential, but the timing isn't right for us." Elena had read Carmen's deck twice, and then called her directly and talked to her for 90 minutes, and then sent a term sheet the following week. Carmen had called her when she received it. There had been a long silence on the phone before Carmen said, "I need to make sure this is real." "It's real," Elena had said. "I've been pitching this for 2 years," Carmen said. "I had investors tell me the product was solid, but I wasn't the right person to scale it." A 50-year-old woman from San Antonio. "You're 44, Elena said. "I know how old I am." "Good, because you've got at least 20 years of work in you, and the product is not just solid, it's genuinely better than anything else in this space. And I am not in the habit of passing on things that are genuinely better than anything else in their space, because the founder doesn't look like what the industry has decided founders are supposed to look like." She paused. "Do you want the term sheet or not?" Carmen had laughed, a startled, relieved, slightly disbelieving laugh, and said yes, she wanted the term sheet. That was what the fund was. Not an abstraction, not a thesis statement. Carmen Ruiz and the infrastructure platform, and the 11 rejections and the 90-minute phone call, and the term sheet that had finally landed in the right hands. Elena lay in the dark and thought about that, and about the women who had pitched her that she couldn't yet back, the ones where the timing wasn't right, or the capital wasn't available, or the fit wasn't close enough, and the responsibility she felt toward them that was not guilt but was something. Adjacent to it, the awareness that the gap she was trying to close was significantly larger than one fund could close, and that the fund mattered precisely because it was a proof point, a demonstration that the math worked when you looked in the right places, and that proof points mattered because the people who controlled large capital pools moved in response to evidence, slowly and with enormous friction, but they moved. She was building the evidence. It was going to take longer than she wanted it to. She was, for the first time in a very long time, not in a hurry. Milo Nathaniel Marlowe was born on the 14th of December at 6:51 in the morning at a hospital in San Francisco where Elena had moved 6 weeks before his due date because she had decided she wanted to be in California for the birth, and also because she had quietly purchased a house in Sausalito Small by the standards of what she could now afford, large by the standards of what she needed, and she had wanted time to make it feel like home before he arrived. The labor was 18 hours, which was not what anyone had planned for, and there were several points during it where she said things she would not repeat in professional contexts. And Nathaniel held her hand through all of it, with the steadiness of a man who had decided before he walked into the hospital that this was where he was going to be, and that no variation in the experience was going to change that, and she was grateful for him in a way that went beyond language. Not because he did anything extraordinary, but because he simply did not leave, which was, she had learned, more extraordinary than it sounded. Milo arrived screaming, which the nurse told her was a very good sign. She held him for the first time, with her arms shaking from exhaustion and the particular overwhelming sensation of a person whose body has just done the most significant thing it has ever done and is now being asked to also feel emotions about it. She had told herself in advance that she would be prepared. She was not prepared. She did not think it was possible to be prepared for the specific gravity of the moment when another human being looks at your face for the first time with eyes that do not yet understand what they're seeing, but are looking anyway. She cried. She had cried at difficult moments in her life before, alone in a Lisbon apartment, on a transatlantic flight, in the car after a 20-week ultrasound that showed a heartbeat continuing independently of her fear. This was different. This was not relief or grief or the complicated, layered emotion of someone who had survived something hard. This was simpler than all of that. This was just full. She was full, in the literal and figurative sense, and something that had been held at a careful distance for a very long time had arrived, and she was not prepared for it, and she did not need to be. Nathaniel sat beside her on the edge of the hospital bed, and he looked at Milo, and his face did the thing it did sometimes when he thought about something he loved, the small private change that he didn't perform for anyone. "Hi," he said to Milo very quietly. "Hi, kid." Milo continued to be a baby and to have the extremely clear priorities of a newborn, which did not include engaging with introductions. "He'll warm up," Elena said. "I can wait," Nathaniel said. The Sausalito house was small and faced the water and had a garden that was overgrown in a way she had not yet decided whether to address, and the light in the mornings came through the east-facing windows in the kitchen and lay across the floor in long rectangles that moved slowly as the sun shifted. And she had not expected to love it as immediately and completely as she did, but she did. She worked from home through December and into January, which meant she worked from the kitchen table and the couch, and occasionally the garden when Milo was sleeping and the weather permitted, which in Marin County in winter meant intermittently and with the appropriate layering. She did not try to maintain the pace she'd had before the birth, not because she couldn't, but because she had made a deliberate choice, after Milo arrived, to understand that the fund would not collapse if she spent 3 hours a day being a person who was also a mother, rather than only a fund manager who happened to have a baby in the next room. This was harder than she expected. Not the motherhood, or not only that, though motherhood was as hard as she'd been told and as unreplicable as experience, the specific daily humility of being responsible for a person who cannot communicate with language and whose needs have to be read from sound and expression and behavior, and whose vulnerability is so total that it rearranges your own sense of what matters. The hard part was the permission, the internal negotiation of allowing herself to be in the slower register without translating it into failure. She talked to a therapist about this, a woman in Mill Valley who had been recommended by a friend, whose office was small and cluttered, and whose approach was direct in a way Elena found useful. "You've built your sense of competence on speed," the therapist said in their third session, "on being ahead of the situation. And now you're in a situation that doesn't reward speed. It rewards presence. Those are different skills. I know they're different skills. Knowing they're different skills and being okay with the one you're currently developing are two different things." Elena had looked at her. "You're going to say something uncomfortable now." "Probably." The therapist had the equanimity of someone who had been saying uncomfortable things professionally for a long time. "You built the fund from a place of needing to prove something. That's not a criticism. The thing you needed to prove was real, and the proof was real, and the fund is real. But now you have the proof, and you need to figure out who you are on the other side of the proof, when you don't need to prove it anymore." Elena had thought about that for a long time. Not in the session. She had given some answer that was only partially honest in the session, because she was still working on being fully honest in rooms where someone was watching closely. But afterward, in the kitchen in Sausalito with Milo, asleep in the carrier she wore around the house, she had thought about what it meant to have needed to prove something, and then to have proven it, and what you were supposed to do with yourself once the thing that organized your energy was no longer necessary. The answer, she thought, was not to find a new thing to prove. The answer was something quieter and more difficult and less satisfying in the short term, to stop organizing yourself around proof at all, to do the work because the work was worth doing, because Carmen Ruiz's infrastructure platform was genuinely better than anything else in its space and deserved capital, not because backing Carmen Ruiz would demonstrate something about Elena Marloz's judgment to the people who had underestimated her. She was not there yet. She was pointed in the right direction. In February, she wrote the open letter. She had not planned it. It had started as something she was writing for herself, a document she kept returning to over several weeks that was partly journal and partly argument and partly the kind of thing you write when you have something to say that doesn't have an obvious form. Nathaniel read a draft and said it was the clearest thing she had ever written about what she understood, which he meant as a compliment, and she received as one. She published it through the fund's newsletter, which had a subscriber list of roughly 4,000 people, most of them in the investment and entrepreneurship world. She did not expect it to go far beyond that. It went considerably further than that. The letter was not long 1,400 words. which was short for the weight of what it contained. She wrote about what it felt like to have your analysis absorbed into someone else's narrative. She wrote about the specific confusion of being told, implicitly and sometimes explicitly, that you were not the right person to stand in front of the room and present the thinking that had come from your own mind. She wrote about the grief of 3 pregnancies and the long aftermath of that grief, and what it had done to her marriage, and what she had done about it. She did not write about Adrian by name. She wrote about a dynamic, the way that institutions and relationships and systems can take what is useful from people and return to them a carefully edited version of themselves, smaller than what went in. She wrote about Portugal, about sitting in cafes for 3 hours with 1 coffee and a notebook, writing things she'd never show anyone, figuring out what was actually there, when she stopped performing confidence and started practicing it. She wrote about what it cost to leave, not the financial cost, which was real. The interior cost, the way that leaving a life you have organized yourself around, even when that life has stopped serving you, requires a kind of grief for the version of yourself who believed in it. And she wrote about what she had found on the other side, not triumph. She was careful about that. She did not write a piece about winning. She wrote about the specific texture of arriving somewhere that felt, for the first time, like it was actually where she was supposed to be, not because it was easy or because it had all worked out, but because it was hers. She had built it. No one had handed it to her, and no one had built it alongside her in the way that required her to share the credit with a story that wasn't accurate. It was hers in the specific, unglamorous, real sense of having been constructed from her own decisions, her own analysis, her own willingness to be wrong about things and correct course. She wrote, "Near the end, I spent a long time being underestimated by someone who had the opportunity to know better. But I spent even longer underestimating myself, measuring my worth by whether he could see it, as if his vision were the standard. The hardest thing I have ever done is not the fund, not the investments, not the work. The hardest thing was learning to stop waiting for external confirmation that I was allowed to take up the space I was already standing in." She sent it. She went to feed Milo. By the time she came back to her laptop 40 minutes later, the email notifications had stopped being individual and become a number she couldn't easily count. By that evening, the letter had been shared across financial media, LinkedIn, and several platforms she didn't personally use. And by the following morning, it had been quoted in 2 publications and referenced in 3 podcast discussions. And a journalist from a major magazine had reached out requesting an interview that she would decline, but that indicated the letter had landed somewhere larger than a newsletter. She did not read most of the responses. She read some of them, the ones from women who wrote to say they had recognized something in the piece that they had not been able to name before, from founders who had experienced some version of the dynamic she described, from a few people who disagreed with her and said so clearly, and whose disagreement she found more interesting than the agreement, because at least it engaged with the argument rather than reflecting it back. She did not read the one from Adrian. She knew it had arrived. Nathaniel mentioned it, neutrally, because he had seen it in the general correspondence and thought she should know it existed. He did not tell her what it said. He left that decision to her. She left it unread for 2 weeks. Then, on a Tuesday morning in March, with Milo asleep in the carrier, and the light coming through the kitchen windows in the long rectangles she had come to think of as a reliable daily fact, she opened it. It was not long. It said, "I read the piece. I have read it several times. I'm not writing to explain myself or to ask for anything. I'm writing because I want to say, without conditions attached, that I know the parts of what you described that belong to what happened between us. I did not see you clearly when I should have. I took what was useful, and I told a story about the rest that was easier than the truth. I'm sorry for that. Not in the way that's looking for a response or a conversation or any particular outcome. Just actually sorry. I hope you and your son are well." It was signed with his name. She read it twice. Then she set the laptop aside and sat with her coffee and looked at the water through the window. The bay gray-green in the morning, a container ship moving slowly toward the bridge. The particular flatness of winter water that was beautiful in a quiet way she had not expected to find beautiful, and now couldn't imagine living without. She thought about what to do with the email. She was not inclined toward a response, not because she was still angry with him, because she wasn't, or not in the active sense. Anger required a continued investment of energy in the direction of a person, and she had, over the course of 2 years and 1 life and 1 child and 1 fund and 1 place that was actually hers, gradually withdrawn that investment. Not as an act of forgiveness. Exactly, forgiveness was too neat a word for something that was messier and slower and didn't arrive in a moment. More as a natural outcome of being genuinely occupied with things that were worth her attention. He had done something wrong. He had also, it appeared, done the harder thing of looking at it without someone requiring him to. She had not expected that, and she was not going to pretend she expected it, but she also was not going to pretend it was nothing. She thought about what her therapist had said about proof, about the difference between doing the work because it was worth doing and doing it to demonstrate something. She thought about Carmen Ruiz, who had pitched to 11 people who didn't see her before walking into a room with someone who did. She thought about Milo, asleep against her chest with the total unconscious trust of an infant who had, in his 3 months of existence, already organized himself completely around the specific fact of her voice, her warmth, her heartbeat, which he had been listening to for longer than he had been alive in the world. She thought about what she wanted to teach him, not the lesson of the letter, not the public version of it, which was about capital and recognition and the structural dynamics of who gets seen, the private lesson, the one you teach not by saying but by being. She wanted to teach him that worth was not contingent, that you didn't earn the right to know your own value by having it confirmed by the right people in the right rooms, that the work of being yourself, the actual imperfect, incomplete, still figuring it out work of being a specific person in the world, was not a performance for an audience. It was just what you did, daily, in the kitchen and the garden and the early mornings, with the light on the floor and the baby asleep and the water outside and the work waiting. She was not going to be able to teach him that with words. She was going to have to keep living it, imperfectly, until it was true enough to be visible. She opened a new email. She thought about what to say. She wrote, "Thank you for writing. I appreciate it. Take care of yourself." She sent it. She closed the laptop. Milo stirred against her, made a small sound that was not distress, just presence, just the ordinary signal of a person who is awake and aware and taking in the world with the uncomplicated attention of someone who doesn't yet know that paying attention is a skill some people spend their whole lives trying to recover. "Good morning," she said. He turned his face toward her voice. Outside, the bay did what it always did. The ship continued toward the bridge. The light moved across the kitchen floor in its slow, reliable arc. Somewhere in the house, her phone was indicating that the day had started without her, and there were messages and calls and a fund that was deployed, and companies that needed attention, and a world that was moving at its usual pace. She would get to it. She always got to it. But for now, she stayed where she was, in the kitchen, in the light, with her son awake against her chest and the water visible through the window, and the particular quiet of a morning that belonged entirely to her, and she was not waiting for anything, and she was not proving anything, and she was not managing anything. She was just there. That was enough. She had finally understood the whole point. There is a version of this story that ends with a scorecard, with the funds, returns, and Vault-Tec struggles, and Adrian's reckoning laid out in a column of facts that adds up to something tidy. The woman wins. The man loses. The accounting is clear. But the truth of it is less clean than that, and more worth having. Adrian Vale did not collapse. He went back to San Francisco and he had the conversation with Serena, and he worked on the board problems, and the Q4 numbers came in better than Q3, and the Marek deal closed. Eventually, after a restructured timeline and a more honest set of projections than the original. He and Serena remained together, and it was difficult in the specific ways that relationships are difficult when one person is learning to be different and the other person is deciding whether to wait for the learning to result in something. They went to therapy together, and individually, which he had resisted, and then stopped resisting when it became clear that resistance was itself one of the things he needed to examine. He was not a changed man. He was a man in the process of change, which is slower and less satisfying and considerably more real. He read Elena's letter, and he wrote his email, and he received 2 sentences in return, and he understood from the 2 sentences that the account between them was closed, not wiped clean, because nothing is wiped clean but settled, in the way that things settle when both parties have finally agreed on what actually happened. He went back to work. Nathaniel Cross returned from London in December, in time for Milo's arrival, and held his son for the first time in a hospital room in San Francisco, with the particular expression of a man who has spent his professional life making careful, analytical decisions, and has now encountered something for which no analytical framework is adequate and has decided that this is acceptable. He did not try to name what he felt. He held the child and he stayed, and that was what there was to do. He and Elena were not a perfect couple. They were two complicated people who had each arrived at their relationship carrying the specific damage of prior lives, and who had chosen each other with the full knowledge of that damage, rather than the innocent ignorance that sometimes protects people in early love. They argued about the pace of her work schedule, about his tendency to offer solutions when she needed to be heard, about the particular domestic friction of two people who are both accustomed to operating with high autonomy, suddenly sharing space with a newborn who has opinions about everything and communicates them without moderation. They worked it out, mostly. Sometimes slowly. Sometimes only after saying the wrong thing first. That was the marriage they were building, not a monument, but a practice. Daily, imperfect, worth it. And Elena, in the Sausalito kitchen with the morning light and the baby and the water outside Elena, was not done. She was not arrived at some final station, where the work of becoming herself was complete and she could rest in the achievement. She was still in it, still finding the edges of who she was and wasn't, still surprised sometimes by the places where the old reflexes lived, the instinct to make herself smaller, to defer, to check whether she was taking up too much space. The instinct didn't disappear. She had just learned to notice it before it made the decision for her. That was the work. Not the fund, not the keynote, not the letter that traveled further than she expected. Those were the evidence. The work was the daily decision, repeated and imperfect, to remain herself without apology in the kitchen and the boardroom and the hospital and the garden and every ordinary room in between. She looked at her son, who was looking at her with the total, unhurried attention of someone who has not yet learned to look anywhere else. She had promised him nothing grandiose. She was not the kind of person who made promises she couldn't quantify. But she had made, in the quiet of the first night after he was born, a single private commitment, not to teach him his worth by telling him about it, but to let him watch her know hers. That was the promise. She intended to keep it.